Hello everyone, I am myself Dr. Rajesh Gubba. I am the General Medicine Educator. So in this session I will be discussing about the cerebral hemisphere, that is the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, what are their functions and what will happen if there is any lesion to that particular lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. So it is a part of the continuation of discussion of the cerebrovascular accidents. So if you take the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, like we have the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, the parietal lobe and as well as the occipital lobe. And how will the questions be asked on this? Like I'll just give you a sample question. So this is how the question can be asked. A lesion in the paracentral lobule causes contralateral foot weakness, seizures only, migraine, cognitive loss. So a lesion in paracentral lobule, what will be the feature? So first of all, what is that you need to know? Where will be the paracentral lobule? What will be the function of the paracentral lobule? And what will happen if there is lesion within the paracentral lobule? So all that you have to understand. So for that, let me discuss about the basic structure of the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, their functions, and simultaneously I will be discussing about like what will happen or what will be the clinical features whenever there is damage to that particular part of the cerebral hemisphere. So you have to understand that regarding motor cortex, the anatomical parts of the body, they are arranged somatotopically, right? They are arranged somatotopically. So we have the lateral convexity of cerebral hemisphere, right? So this will be, right, this will be the lateral convexity of cerebral hemisphere. Then followed by that we have the medial most part of the cerebral hemisphere. So in these particular areas, the body parts of an individual, they are arranged somatotopically. So if you take the lower part of the lateral extremity, right, in the lower part of the lateral extremity or lower part of the lateral convexity, right, the area represented are the lips, right. So this particular part of the lateral convexity, it represents the anatomical areas like lips, it represents anatomical part like tongue, and it represent the anatomical area of the face and as well as the hand. So these are the anatomical structures which are represented on the lower part of the lateral extremity. So if there is any lesion in the lower part of the lateral extremity, then there will be weakness in all these areas, right? There will be weakness in the lips, tongue, face and as well as within the hand, right? And you take the higher on the convexity of the frontal lobe, right? So right, if you take the higher on convexity of the frontal lobe, that will represent the arm, that will represent the trunk, that will represent the hip. So the arm, trunk and as well as the hip, these are the structures which are represented in the higher on the convexity of the frontal lobe. Whereas you take on the medial surface of the frontal lobe. On the medial surface of the frontal lobe, you have the lower part of the body. So on the medial surface of the frontal lobe, the anatomical areas which are being represented are the foot, then the lower leg, then followed by that the genitals. Okay, so these are the anatomical structures which are present on the medial surface of the frontal lobe. Now, you take the paracentral lobule, right? The question was on the paracentral lobule. See, the paracentral lobule, where is it present? This particular paracentral lobule, it is situated on the medial surface of the frontal lobe. Right, it is situated on the medial surface of the frontal lobe. And the medial surface of the frontal lobe, right, the medial surface of the frontal lobe, what all it corresponds to? It corresponds to the motor leg area, right, the medial surface of the frontal lobe, it corresponds to the motor leg area. Right, and if there is any lesion in the paracentral lobule, right, if there is any lesion in the paracentral lobule, that will cause the weakness of the contralateral foot. Right, that will cause the weakness of the contralateral foot. So these will be the features whenever there is damage to paracentral lobule. So paracentral lobule, it is situated on the medial surface of the frontal lobe, and this is the motor leg area. So any lesion in the paracentral lobule will cause weakness of the contralateral foot. Now, I have said you the topographic distribution. So what did I tell you? Starting in the lower part of the lateral extremity, you have the lips, tongue, face, and as well as the hand. Whereas higher on the convexity of the frontal lobe, you have arm, trunk, and as well as the hip. They are represented in order higher on the convexity of the frontal lobe. Whereas on the medial surface of the frontal lobe, you have the foot, lower leg, and as well as the genitals. And paracentral lobule, if there is any lesion, the individual will have the contralateral foot weakness. So, a lesion in the frontal paracentral lobule will cause the contralateral foot weakness, right? So that is about like the frontal lobe and their respective topographic distribution of the entire body on the frontal lobe. Now, whenever the frontal lobe is damaged, like what will be the features? You see the question. The characteristic features of the frontal lobe tumor is abnormal gait, apraxia, distractibility, antisocial behavior. So, you take the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex, it is mainly concerned with motor function. Frontal cortex, it is concerned with frontal eye field, and the frontal cortex, it is concerned with the motor speech. Right, so these are the main functions of the frontal cortex: motor function, the frontal eye field, and as well as the motor speech. Now, apart from these important functions, the frontal lobe is also concerned with the initiation of the complex activities. Right, it is also concerned with initiation of complex activities. Right, that is another important function of the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex. And this particular frontal lobe, it also participates in the higher order function. And what is that higher order function that is being done by the frontal lobe is reasoning. Number 2, abstraction. And judgment. Right, reasoning, abstraction, and as well as the judgment. And apart from that, the frontal lobe is also involved in planning and initiating adaptive responses. Right, planning and initiating the adaptive responses. And this frontal lobe, it is also concerned with inhibiting maladaptive behavior. Right, it is also concerned with inhibiting the maladaptive behavior. And this is also concerned with prioritizing and sequencing actions. So, the frontal lobe is the one which will cause that prioritization, right? The process of the prioritization, this is important, this is less important. So this I have to do first, this I have to do later. That is sequencing action that is being done by your frontal lobe. And inhibiting the maladaptive behavior, right? Urination, or that is your micturition, or emptying the bowel, right? That is passing for the motion. So, the individual has a particular habit of going to an appropriate place and do the process of micturition. And if the frontal lobe is gone, right, the individual will not have that particular habit of doing a proper behavior. So he will have an antisocial behavior. And that inhibiting maladaptive behavior is the function of the frontal lobe, right? And the frontal lobe also helps in making you to have a foresight and as well as the tactfulness. Right, foresight and as well as the tactfulness. And so that means like the frontal lobe is the one which helps you in planning a particular event or a particular consequences. That foresight is the one which is being designed and planned by the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe also tells you, right, it will also helps you to distinguish between right and wrong. Right, between right and wrong. And it also tells you what is pleasure and what is displeasure. Okay, so that is what is being done by the frontal lobe. Reasoning and abstraction, judgment, planning and initiating the adaptive responses, inhibiting the maladaptive behavior, prioritizing and sequencing action, foresight and tactfulness, distinguishing between the right and wrong, pleasure and as well as displeasure. So all that are being done by the frontal lobe. And the patient shows the following characteristic features whenever there is damage to the frontal lobe. So patient becomes apathetic, right? So right, patient becomes apathetic, right? That is, patient becomes motionless, and mute, right? Second important in case of the frontal lobe syndrome is patient becomes irritable and there will be syndrome of disinhibition. Right, syndrome of disinhibition, in which the patients appear labile and irritable. Right, patient appears labile and irritable, and the patient becomes inattentive and distractible. Right, the patient becomes inattentive and distractible, and there is also impaired judgment and loss of usual inhibition. So the individual will not be able to make out what is right and wrong. Right, and the individual is unable to make out what is pleasure and displeasure, and the individual is unable to decide the prioritization and as well as sequencing, and there is also loss of usual inhibition. Right, loss of usual inhibition, and the frontal lobe lesion also cause aphasia, right, that is loss of speech. And what type of aphasia the individual will develop? That is Broca's aphasia, right? And these individuals with the frontal lobe syndrome, they behave in such a way that the usual social activity is being disturbed. There is no proper reasoning and abstraction. The individual will have a maladaptive behavior. There is no foresight. There is no tactfulness. The individual is not able to distinguish between right and wrong, pleasure and as well as displeasure. So these will be the features of your frontal lobe syndrome. Now you take the broad main areas in the frontal cortex. We have area number 4. Area number 4, it is a primary motor cortex. Right, it is a primary motor cortex, and the function of the area number 4 is that it is responsible for contralateral voluntary movements. Right, it is responsible for contralateral voluntary movements. And what will be the clinical features of this particular frontal lobe involvement? If the area number 4 is damaged, what will be the clinical features? See, if the lesion, if it is an irritative lesion, right, if it is an irritative lesion, that will cause the seizures. And if it is a destructive lesion, right, if it is a destructive lesion, that will produce contralateral flaccid paralysis. Right, if it is a destructive lesion, that will produce contralateral flaccid paralysis, right? And for example, along with area see, flaccid paralysis is that like where you have lower motor neuron type of features, but along with area number 4, if there is also involvement of area number 6, right? If there is also involvement of the area number 6, then the individual will develop spasticity. Right? Spasticity occurs if area number 6 is also involved. So that is about the features of the involvement of the area number 4. So area 4 or primary motor cortex, that is responsible for contralateral voluntary movement.